One for the Road, Chapter 9. Ben entered the lobby of the Castle Carlisle so perplexed that he forgot all about his pile of possessions by the front door for a moment. His conversation with the supposed private investigator, Rafael Velas, was replaying in his head over and over. It had been odd, mostly the fact that he only really seemed to be concerned with Ben's dream. There was something more. It was almost like Velas wasn't really looking for anything, like he already knew what Ben's answers would be to his questions. The way he had left promptly after hearing the retelling, no further questions, was also odd. What could nightmares possibly have to do with a PI's work? Unless Velas, not wanting to alarm a kid, thought it wasn't a dream, but framed it that way to keep him calm. Yet it was a dream. It had felt like a dream, and what's more, there was the deadbolt lock unmoved. His next thought was maybe it was some kind of carbon monoxide leak, and Velas was investigating the owner of the hotel for being a slumlord. That made his concern with the dream make sense, but Ben thought the PI would have at least let him know to check out if that were the case. He settled on the latter and decided that Rafael Velas just didn't give a shit if he or any other homeless person died from the leak. On the contrary, it would probably make his job that much simpler and the case easier to prove. He had no choice but to stay in the hotel tonight. It was dark now, and besides, he didn't have his tent with him. He would sleep with the window cracked and the bathroom exhaust fan on tonight, and hope that was enough to keep him safe from the gas until morning. He would be checking out of Castle Carlisle first thing. Now he knew it was too good to be true. Burke was stoking a large fire in the yawning brick fireplace that adorned the far wall of the lounge area. It was out of place in a Southern California hotel, certainly in Skid Row, and it wasn't that cold outside either. It was an amenable 73 degrees. Inside the lobby, it was freezing though, despite the raging fire. It was almost like his dream, but not quite that cold, he thought. He would have just snuck past the tall, gaunt man who glares at dogs like he wants to stomp on them, but there was the matter of his $100. After all was said and done, Ben will have been paid $50 to get a few hot showers and decent night's rest, not counting the other bill he got from Velas. The whole situation was beginning to feel strange in a way he couldn't quite put his finger on. Inexplicably surreal was probably the best way to put it. But it had all worked to his benefit, at least thus far. "Mr. Burke?" "Yes, Ben." He had a strange habit of not turning from what he was working on when speaking to you, as though you weren't worth the distraction. "I took care of everything you asked me to. Dropped off the payment and paperwork and checked out the house. It's all good." Good. Still not looking at him. "I take it you didn't run into any trouble?" For a moment, Ben thought perhaps Burke somehow knew about his conversation with Velas. But that was impossible. The hotel didn't have any security cameras, as far as he had seen, which now that he thought about it was a bit peculiar considering the neighborhood. "Nope, no trouble, just traffic. You know how it is." "Indeed. Let me fetch your pay." Finally, he turned and began to make his way toward the front desk, Ben following. He counted the bills out into Ben's waiting hands, mostly in ones, fives, and tens. $100. "Oh, and Ben, there is something else." "What is it?" he asked, a bit wary. "I spoke to the owner, Mr. Carter, about you. He would like to interview you personally, with the intention of hiring you on full-time. If he approves of you, you would assist me and Mr. Carter himself if he requires it. It's quite the opportunity." If Ben didn't know better, he would think Curtis Burke looked envious, although he couldn't imagine why. "Oh, wow, that's great." Ben was surprised. He had begun to think that Burke disliked him. It was vague, nothing really offensive, just little things, like not turning around to look at him during conversation. "When will he be available?" "Well, Mr. Carter is a bit of an eccentric. He keeps odd hours. He prefers to sleep during the day and conduct his business and leisure in the evening." Burke's lips pursed in a strained-looking smile that didn't touch his eyes, which stared at Ben coldly. Unfortunately, Mr. Carter is already quite busy tonight, but he has asked that I arrange for you to meet with him tomorrow evening, say 7 o'clock? That works for me. Thank you, Mr. Burke, he said, even though he had no intention of attending that interview. No, sir. Velas's investigation, whatever the specifics, was surrounding the hotel's owner, this strange Mr. Carter. He had been willing to tell Ben at least that much. Oh, and one more thing. I have a personal matter that has come up this evening. I'll need to be stepping out as soon as possible. If you would cover the front desk, I'd pay you $50. Otherwise, I'd have to close check-ins. What a tragedy, Ben thought. It wasn't as if the place was exactly bustling with guests. Ben had only seen a single pair of what looked like drug addicts, eyes sunken, faces gaunt, shuffling feet, making their way across the lobby to the front door as he was having his discussion with Burke. There was only them and the dark-haired man in the lounge. But $50 was $50. How long would I have to cover? I'm pretty tired. I don't think I'd make it all night. Just until midnight. Most people checking in after that hour are too unsavory, even for this establishment. He laughed, but Ben wasn't sure what about. Okay, would it be alright if I catch a shower first? He wasn't especially dirty, and he hadn't sweat much throughout the day. He just wanted to take advantage of the luxury while he had it, since he knew he was planning to check out. Of course, but please, be quick. It is a rather urgent matter, I'm afraid. He showered as quickly as he could, although he did linger longer than needed just to let the hot water rain over him, to savor the way the warmth seemed to soothe aches you weren't aware of. The shower was luckily free of gnawing, creeping dark thoughts about his mother in the past. He did find himself thinking of Rafael Velas, the way he had listened at full attention, hadn't scoffed or laughed, and how his eyes seemed to cut through Ben's every word. Stalwart, as though he had heard the tale 1,000 times. There was something more. He didn't seem like a cop, which is what Ben imagined most PIs were. He was more like a war veteran, one who had seen and had done some terrible shit and came to terms with it begrudgingly. And he seemed capable, as though he kept up some kind of exercise regimen. There didn't appear to be any frailty to him, despite his obvious age. Ben hopped out of the shower and dried off, still thinking about how peculiar his run-in with Velas was, unable to grasp what possible use the dream story could have been to him. It doesn't matter, he told himself, knowing he would be gone from the place in the morning, and got dressed. Before leaving, thinking about his theory about a monoxide leak, he went to open the windows and vent out the room. The windows were of the old-fashioned wood-frame variety and were able to be opened all the way, unlike most hotel windows, although they were barred from the outside, likely to prevent jumpers. In front of the right window, a chill struck him, deep and piercing. One lone fierce shiver ran through his entire body, which was screaming to flee. In that moment, he got a terrible feeling of being watched, of a presence. He felt like prey. He felt small, helpless. He shot his head around and found, thankfully, that he was still alone. When he stepped back from the window, it was like stepping out from inside a walk-in cooler. Relief came over him as his muscles relaxed and whatever animal part of his brain had awakened returned to dormancy. When he was a kid, he and his mother loved to watch shows about paranormal investigators. Ghost Files, Ghost Adventures, America's Most Haunted, Montclair Simmons, The American Exorcist, you name it, they watched it. The schlockier the better. Neither of them really believed the stuff they saw in those shows, but they made for a good laugh, and occasionally, if you could suspend your disbelief for long enough, it could actually be a bit spooky. One thing that was common among all those PIs, the paranormal investigators, Ben wasn't sure why his brain was abbreviating it that way, considering they never referred to themselves as such, was the fact that they searched for cold spots. They would break out an infrared camera and point it around the room until they found a patch of blue, isolated among yellows, oranges, and reds. Ben was sure if he had one of those IR cameras now, he would see a giant blue splotch in the corner of his room. Deep blue, shit, maybe black. Supposedly, these inexplicable cold patches were in fact the presence of a ghost who was remaining unseen. Wasn't that what he had just experienced? There was no vent above him to explain it, and the window hadn't even been opened yet. And there wasn't just the chill, there was that deep, pervading feeling that seemed to rise out of nowhere. It was like instinct. And now that he thought about it, hadn't that been just about where his dream visitor had been standing? And didn't this whole hotel kind of seem like a location from any of those ghost hunting shows? If the place was as old as it seemed, it was a sure candidate for a haunting. But that was also assuming ghosts were real. He left the room sincerely wondering if he had in fact been visited by some kind of apparition. The dream had been ominous enough to believe that, but he'd never heard of a ghost mocking a person's intimate details of their life. That was more like a demon. Ghosts mostly just let out inarticulate groans and wails, right? Despite the rationalization, he found he was growing increasingly more uncomfortable in this place. He even thought he might sleep with Royal tonight, but he would see how he felt later. The elevator ride to the lobby felt twice as long going down as it had coming up, and he was now dreading the prospect of sitting in the empty, cold lobby of a haunted hotel. Why had he accepted? $50, that's why. But God, would turning it down have killed him? No, but every dollar helped, and it would be silly to decline for fear of poltergeists. Burke explained Ben's responsibilities to him, sparing absolutely no detail. Ben couldn't tell whether Burke thought he was an idiot or was just the controlling type who couldn't help but micromanage. Probably a little of column A, a little of column B. He turned over the keys to the cash drawer and warned Ben that if he robbed them, he would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The thought hadn't even crossed his mind, but now that it was said, it seemed to reinforce how strange this whole job proposition was. He showed Ben how to check the books for room vacancies. Just an Excel spreadsheet on an ancient-looking computer, a gateway, a brand that had long since faded into obscurity. There was also an archaic-looking program which operated the machine that turned cold, dead squares of plastic into active key cards. Just enter the room number's code in the program, load the card into the feed end of the machine, helpfully labeled feed, and press activate. It was all rather simple, and if he weren't sure of anything, Burke's diatribe would have definitely filled in any gaps, probably several times over. The strange attendant finally left, apparently when he was certain that he had repeated himself enough times for even this simpleton to have grasped it all. For the first 30 minutes, he kept himself busy by dusting and polishing the front desk and some of the furniture in the lounge, as Burke had done this morning. It certainly didn't need it, but he wouldn't feel right to immediately get on his phone or crack the book he had brought along. Something by Dean Koontz that he had picked up for $1 at Goodwill before at least doing some work. He had watched 1,000 pointless YouTube shorts, finished reading his book, ate the couple of Uncrustables he had grabbed from his room on the way out, watched more videos on a seemingly endless loop, and in all that time not one guest showed up to check in. Not even a drunk accidentally stumbling in. The lobby was utterly devoid of life. He was pacing around the lobby and lounge at around 11, trying to keep himself awake. He had begun to doze off sitting in the chair behind the desk, when finally, the empty monotony was broken by the sound of voices. It was the couple who had left earlier, but now they were a trio. The new man almost fit in perfectly. Once again, he too was pale and gaunt, and looked like he had been deformed by some terrible injury that had left a gaping hole where his nose had been. He looked like he had had quite the rough life. But his clothes were nice, miles above the stuff his companions had on. A black western shirt with a bolo tie, gray jeans, and a beautifully polished pair of cowboy boots to match the shirt. All of it was immaculate. "Don't you two worry now, we got the good stuff upstairs. Fent, China White, you name it. None of that cheap street poison," he was saying to the junkies. So that was it. He was their dealer. "Right on," the woman said distantly, her eyes seeming to stare through everything before her. Ben didn't want to interact with this group, but he knew he had to. It was what Burke was paying him for, after all. Excuse me, sir, are you a guest or a registered visitor? If not, I'll need to check you. Save it, kid. Bert didn't tell you? Tell me? I'm close friends with the owner, a resident. He was looking at Ben with disdain. He found it difficult to meet his gaze and all he wanted was to be rid of this gruesome-looking, skull-faced cowboy. Oh, I'm sorry to have bothered you. Enjoy your night. No response, only a glare, not unlike Burke's, and then to the couple. Come along, y'all. Okay, they droned, nearly in unison, and shuffled behind Skullface. Ben thought they looked as though they were in a trance, Skullface leading them like some kind of hypnotist act from hell. For a moment, he almost felt pulled along by him as well, found himself slowly following their path without thinking about it before course correcting and taking his place back at the desk. He watched them file into the elevator, watched Skullface pull a keycard from his back pocket and scan it before pressing the button for the 13th floor. It was the only one that required a scan to access, and then he saw him smile. For a second, Ben could have sworn he had the grin of a shark. At midnight, Ben promptly performed the closing procedures as elaborated by Burke, shutting down the computer, wiping down the counter, emptying the cash drawer into a lockbox which goes in the bottom drawer of his office desk. He had to shuffle some things around to make it fit, one of which was a small revolver, maybe a .38. He told himself this was a normal item to find in a flophouse attendant's office drawer, and he was probably right, but for some reason he was thoroughly shaken now, and everything seemed just slightly off. He hated the fact that he had to sleep here another night, but the wind was screeching brutally outside, terrible conditions to sleep in exposed, trying to tell himself that he was just giving himself the willies. But Skullface had been talking about drugs, and hadn't Burke said they were strictly forbidden here? He made his way to the elevator. You were just put off by his face. It was a fucking skull. Sometimes it's hard to look at people who are deformed. Reminds us of our own fragility or something, you thought. But there had been something off about that couple, and he thought it perhaps went beyond drugs. Maybe hypnotism wasn't so far off. The elevator doors opened, and he was greeted by that terrible, familiar chill that seemed to scream and counterpoint to all his rationalizations. It shot through his spine and across the rest of his body. It's not as bad, not as piercing as the one in his room, but it was unmistakable. The ghost chill is the only name he can think of for it. But he had seen and spoken to that man, and he was sure it was no dream. He was reminded of the shark grin, then the man in his room, his swirling red eyes, and hadn't he flashed a grin just like Skullface's at him? Yes, he had. Ben shuddered. Sleep did not come easy for him that night. He stood in vigil in the green velvet smoking chair, eyes on the door, knife in his lap. He dozed off, despite his best efforts, in the chair at around 4 a.m. Thankfully, there were no dreams, and no strange fanged visitors.